Okay, but we'll kick off. Hi everyone. My name is Gemma Lloyd, and I'm the CEO of Work 180. And welcome to the Going Beyond the Report webinar on gender equity. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which this event is taking place, and pay our respects to Indigenous elders of the past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also recognise those whose ongoing efforts to protect and promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures will leave a lasting legacy for future elders and leaders. Next slide, please. So today's agenda, we're going to start off with a quick refresher on some of the findings from the What Women Want report. We sent out a survey before this webinar asking what you wanted to hear about, and you responded. So thank you for that. So we'll be going through those items around what you want to hear about and sharing some actionable insights. At the end, we'll then be going into Q&A. Throughout this webinar, please feel free to put your questions into our Q&A box, and we'll get to them in the Q&A section at the end. Next slide, please, Anna. So as mentioned, my name is Gemma Lloyd, CEO of Work 180, and I'm delighted to be joined here today by two of our DEI advisors at Work 180, Jessie Yu and Anna Kondratz. Next slide, please. So who we are and why we exist. So gender equity is over 135 years away. There's a long way to go. And of course, there's both business reasons, social reasons, economic reasons as to why this is extremely important. But what I'm really proud of at Work 180 is in an industry defined by good intentions, Work 180 drives measurable, actionable change. And we'll be talking you through some of those things throughout this webinar. Next slide, please. A quick refresher for some of you that haven't worked with us before or maybe new to Work 180. So we are focused on supporting employees to increase gender representation within their workplaces. And in the last year, the average amount in which endorsed employers have increased their gender representation by is 6.65%. And we have a proven process to support employers to be able to achieve this, which is focused on root causes. And so we address the root cause of why women may not be interested in working for the employer, which comes down to branding, applying for the jobs, which is talent acquisition, accepting the offer through that hiring pipeline, and then thriving in your workplace. And so any issues regarding retention. And on the right-hand side, you can see a number of things that we do there to contribute to long-term sustainable gender diversity within your organisation. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to do a quick recap on the findings from the What Women report. I'm sure most of you have had the opportunity to download and research some of these, so this is just setting a little bit of context before I hand over to our DEI advisors. Next slide, please, Anna. So to start off with, the top priorities for women in the workplace within Australia, flexible and remote working came in at number one. Likewise in the UK, there's not a lot of surprise here in terms of that being the number one priority for women, particularly with return to office mandates starting to come back into play. In Australia, the second priority is an inclusive culture and competitive remuneration, paid leave entitlements, then women in leadership positions and career development opportunities. I won't read out all of the different regions, but you can see there it varies slightly, but there's common themes across all three in terms of what women are looking for. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the top in-demand policies, number one is that flexible working policy. So 69% of respondents to our What Women Want survey said that this was important when they're considering a new employer. Very close on the second is a zero tolerance policy for preventing and addressing sexual harassment. And number three is pay transparency, coming in at 61%. What was really interesting about the data is that with pay transparency, that came in at number one for our workers that are in our Generation Z. So those born in the late 1990s to early 2000s had pay transparency as the number one policy that they would like to see. Next slide, please. Now, what's putting off women applying to roles. So I won't read out all of these again. It's all in the What Women Want report. But number one is a lack of clarity or inconsistent information about the recruiter or interviewer about company benefits and policies. So it's very, very important that our workplaces not just have the policies and benefits, but those are communicated clearly, both internally and externally. The data shows that if these are not communicated clearly internally and externally, it is putting women off applying for roles within your organization. Next slide, please. And this is the last one that I'm going to touch on before we can get into all the good stuff with our DEI advisors. So candidates now have a different behaviour to what they had 5-10 years ago, and searching for policies and benefits is very, very important. And so essentially there's been a flip in terms of the power going from employer to job seeker. So candidates are looking at your social media platforms, they're looking at employee review platforms, they're also talking to their networks to see what your organisation is doing to support gender equity. They're looking at different news articles around this, and also reaching out to current employees for their first-hand experiences. So this is why, particularly with that last one, it's really important that we don't just have policies and benefits, but of course, these are communicated clearly across the organisation and essentially walking the talk. So that's a little bit of context before like I said, we get into the good stuff. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jessie.
Thanks, Gemma. So prior to this webinar, we sent out a question to all of you who'd registered as to what you wanted to learn about the most. And overwhelmingly, the 3 things that we got back were gaining company-wide buy-in, measuring progress, and what sort of metrics to look at, as well as gaining leadership buy-in. Next slide. So let's kick off by talking about measuring progress. When we talk about driving actionable change, it's really important to understand some holistic measures when we're talking about DEI in the workplace. So those of you who are already partnered with Work 180 have access to this. And for those who are yet to work with us, this is just a way that we actually make sure that across 3 key areas, being employer branding, talent acquisition, and retention, that companies can keep track of the metrics that matter the most. If you look at the very top of that overarching goal, that's the starting point before segmenting down into some of these other specific targets.
But Jessie, that seems like a lot to cover.
Yeah, this is a pretty overwhelming slide when you look at just how many metrics. So by no means are we saying measure each and every one and track them and have a strategy and the same amount of effort. You'll notice that some of them are ticked and highlighted to indicate that those, for this example company, are the most important. If you look at percentage of women applicants, we know that lots of companies right now don't tend to track this metric. So you can also see that the goal there is actually to start measuring percentage of women applicants to better understand the gender equity journey there. Next slide, please. So to accompany what you just saw, there are a number of things across the employee lifecycle, from hiring to promotions to applicants, as well as representation of women in leadership, that we can also support you to look at, and we recommend companies do look at as well. You'll see that the dark green, which is where the company currently is contrasted with the goals in the light green to be able to see and measure how on track we are across that employee lifecycle. Over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Jessie. So let's dive into the other point that you wanted to learn about, which is creating followership. And that can be at leadership level as well as on a company-wide scale. So let's start with some examples and phrases that might be quite familiar to you, which is, for example, when you talk to leaders across the business, I don't see gender, I don't see race, I treat everyone equal. And while those individuals might have very well good intentions, you can see there might be a gap between intention and the impact those sentences and those intentions have across the business.
So Anna, the thing is, when we talk with companies and there are actual programs in place, say women in leadership programs, targets for women, there's often backlash in organizations as well to ask, well, what about everyone else? Why do you think that is?
Well, that's what I think this infographic is shown very clearly where that distinction is coming from, or that misunderstanding. Because one of the most common misconceptions is equality equals equity. And while understanding this image is communicating very clearly, by treating everyone equal, you are not bringing the best self in from everyone to work. Whereas on an equitable approach, you are accepting and acknowledging barriers that have been created over time through history. That might be through to disabilities, gender, age, so race. So let's make sure that we are seeing those barriers, acknowledging them, and making sure everyone can bring their best selves to work. And that is the difference between equality and equity, where we enable our employees to bring their best self to work. And then you might have broader conversations where you can touch on different areas besides that it's just ethically the right thing to do. How can you bring other members or stakeholders across your organization and leadership on board? Well, there is the safety aspect. We know that Australia's silent epidemic is domestic violence. So gender inequality is one of the underlying determinants in that area. In terms of product safety, as an organization, you have products and a variable customer base. So how do you meet those needs? By understanding that you need to employ also a diverse employee base. Airbags are an example where it didn't work out as planned because unfortunately it had fatal consequences for children and women that mainly male employees were involved in the product development. And then there are organizational results that can't be denied, such as a sense of belonging can lead to up to 60% increase in productivity and a 50% increase in, decrease in turnover. And then there are the legal aspects that organizations in particular with 100 or more employees in Australia recently are very well aware of. The gender pay gap movement, where such organizations in the private sector are required to publish their pay gap. So that are reasons why you should care, and how can you communicate that now? Well, let's take a look at some preparation steps that you can take. First of all, it starts with the top. So make sure that you involve executive sponsors along and get them onto your journey. When you do talk about DEI at a company-wide level, make sure that you have senior, ideally at C-suite, your CEO by your side. So employees understand that this is not a nice-to-have initiative, it is a must-have business initiative. And communicating about it, while it could be a face-to-face situation like a town hall, make sure that also your internal comms teams is supporting you and gives you advice on channels where your employees are most engaged.
This is such a good one, Anna, because speaking to some of organizations who have a big office staff and then those who have frontline staff, we've seen instances where lots of the internal comms might be sent through emails, when the reality is people who are on site are just checking their phones and a lot of things get missed. So doing something as simple as making sure that it's communicated in the daily stand-up can make all the difference for attendance.
Absolutely. And here are some of the sample points for an agenda when you are publishing or going through a town hall. So showcasing your company's progress in diversity, equity, and inclusion, which can be how do you perform against other organizations. Work 180, for example, organizations that are endorsed by us, know that we are providing such data, and easily that can track and mark your progress in that space for visible to your employees. Also areas of strength, what contributed to the progress, areas of improvement that the organization has been willing to take to address such barriers that we identified before in our equality versus equity slide. And also create a call to action. So you want to get a movement of followership. So make sure individuals that feel like they want to contribute to that journey, ask them to join and provide them contacts where they can reach out and make sure that they can join you on that journey.
Absolutely. And what we just provided was an example of a singular event that could happen. So if we go back to our sample company and we think about the reasoning for why the business should take this seriously, the tracking and the initiatives, if we look at the perspective of this sample company, perhaps the buy-in is something that can only happen when the metrics are there. So if your organization already has access to the metrics that you need to really measure gender equity progress, it's worthwhile gathering those to be able to then build that business case to then present to the leadership. And that is what makes it possible to do initiatives like showcasing the progress that have already been happening that your company has been undertaking. You'll see here that this is not an overnight fix, an overnight solution. These things do take time across multiple years. And the example that you see here may not be relevant to all organizations. We know that for some of you, the data that you need to access may not be as neat and readily available as what you'd like. So sometimes the buy-in might need to happen first from leadership before you can implement the changes to start to track. Regardless of your journey, the idea is with a combination of these and fantastic questions from the audience in terms of submitting them as things you wanted to know more about, what's required to continuously put in the work, showcase that progress, and make sure that everyone in the company is actively involved.
So let's take a look at some actionable insights. So we followed and again asked questions to our audience, what you want to learn more about. So we decided, besides addressing those, we also want to address insights that our community, in particular women, are looking for. And that is, as Gemma mentioned in the early stages of the webinar, number one benefit that women are looking for in Australia is flexible working. So one of our endorsed employers, Stake, faced the challenge, as many other employers in Australia recently, how to bring back employees post-COVID while ensuring that the employee engagement is not dropping. The solution, Stake identified barriers of their employees by running a survey that identified commute time was one of the key barriers that employees were experiencing in returning to the office. So what they did, they took a proactive step, met their employees exactly where they were, and implemented the so-called commuter leave. This is still very recent, so we don't have the stats return yet as employees being in office regularly, but one thing the Stake has shared with us, and that was very inspiring. The engagement is incredible, and the team is very happily to engage in face-to-face activities in the office.
When we take a look at pay transparency, one of the most in-demand things that women are looking for now, if we take a look at what NBN had, they had a target to ensure 40% of women in management positions. If we take a look at their solution, one thing that we encourage organizations to do is, alongside some of those classic metrics, which of course include the bottom line of a company, to really look at how to ensure the gender pay gap can be one of those metrics that are tracked and reported on company-wide, which in the case for NBN was able to, by their calculations, result in a gender pay gap that was actually slightly in favor of women, reducing it dramatically from what they had been experiencing just 2 to 3 years prior.
So we would like you to take out your phones and scan that QR code. And because we wanted to make as valuable for you as possible, let us know. You mentioned that pay transparency was one of the top key benefits or entitlements you wanted to learn more about. So based on that example now that Jessie just shared from NBN, what else is there that you would like to know? Is it the implementation of the policy, how to get buy-in for such measures? And if you share that with us, we would then like to come back to it also in our Q&A section. But while it is fresh in your mind, we would love to hear from you. Mm-hmm. Getting ELT, so buy-in. Okay. So please feel free also to keep responding. So we will capture that data, and even if we can't address things in a Q&A, we will keep those in mind also for future events to make sure that we are meeting our community where they are at. But I think one of the key things is buy-in around it on executive level, how to change leaders' minds, and how to also make it a conversation that you can have. Okay, and implementation. Okay, thank you. So one of the other top benefits that we identified that women are looking for through our What Women Want survey is career development opportunities. So the challenge is being faced, in particular in male-dominated industries, to have equitable representation of women in leadership, fulfilling and supporting career pathways for women, and recruitment of and support of female apprentices in male-dominated roles. And this is now of an example company from the energy sector. So the solution that that particular company met, they again asked women, because they wanted to recruit women to go that extra mile, what steps and initiatives can we take to design a program that is particularly targeted at female apprentices? And that's how they established their early talent pathway for women in in-field technician roles. And also making sure that career development programs are in place for women that are currently in field roles, that they keep promoting and growing within the company.
I love the co-design and the consultation aspect of that example, because we'll see that in this accessibility one as well, where Yarra Trams, who are a transport provider here in Victoria, have the considerable challenge of looking at the accessibility needs, not only of their employees and partners, but also customers, people who rely on the network work day to day, and reducing those barriers to travel for people with disabilities. Next. So a number of things that they did, and what's in similar with the previous case study, was formulating the plan in consultation with community, especially people with lived experience of disability. There's the ability for all organisations to register disability action plans with the Australian Human Rights Commission. And for Yarra Trams as well, a big shout out for the fact that not only do they have the full version of their accessibility action plan, but they also created an easy English version, which just makes for that much more inclusivity to make sure that the plan can be communicated. And that's all complemented as well by internal comms to increase awareness and education.
And then coming to the menopause policy and entitlements across various sectors. So while the menopause policy is currently one of the top policies that employers endorsed by Work 180 are downloading and looking to implement, only under 20% of endorsed employers have currently implemented that policy. So what is the challenge? The challenge is overall what every organization faces in the early stages around this, a lack of awareness of the symptoms that individuals experiencing menopause or endometriosis, which is heavy bleeding throughout the menstruation phase, are experiencing heavy pain and therefore less likely to be productive and effective at work.
And let's not forget, Anna, that while we see a rise in menopause being talked about, and it was one of the most requested policies for this webinar, there continues to be the language around it being a women's issue. And what we know is that that doesn't acknowledge gender non-conforming individuals who also experience menopause, or the fact that women don't necessarily experience menopause as well. So that really continues to lay out a challenge in terms of the language inclusivity.
So what is the solution? Well, we have some employers with the following examples. Implementation of 5 days of leave in addition to other leave entitlements. So it's a dedicated leave benefit. Also establishing safe language to make it okay to talk about it in the workplace. And you can do that by either addressing or implementing language such as empathy for every journey, which makes it probably more comfortable for employees to talk about it. Or the example from Koala, they implemented a so-called life leave, and employees without questions asked can take that leave. Anglo Gold Ashanti is providing menopause education for men, and Liberty Financial is offering reproductive health leave for all genders. And again, we would like to hear from you if you would take out your phone. And because that was one of the top, or Jessie, was it the most asked benefit? Yes. So we want to give you the chance, what in particular you want to hear about the menopause policy.
Cost-effective ways to implement things outside of leave.
Also here again, getting buy-in. What are the criteria? Education. Okay. All right. Thank you for sharing your opinions, and we will keep capturing.
Fantastic. It's really great to have that interaction and see what's top of mind. Hopefully we'll get to address as much as possible in the Q&A segment. What also was on the list, which didn't make the top 3, but was pretty close there, was how do we go about approaching intersectionality? And the particular example I wanted to offer to all of you was around the way to start embedding intersectionality into your practices. So the challenge is that different DEI pillars and identities are often planned for and worked towards in silos. It's common to have an organization who may have a gender equality action plan, who also have something in place for First Nations participation, who may also have an accessibility action plan. And while these may even be developed by the same people, they don't always necessarily inform each other. So with a state government body that we've been working with, the first simple step that they've started taking is to review existing strategies and action plans with that intersectional lens. So for example, looking at the disability plan with a gender lens and vice versa. And while this may seem really broad and conceptual, it is the most practical place to start when we look at what may already be in place to ensure that we haven't missed out on any other type of intersection. This particular topic is something that Work 180 is delving further and further into. So we also invite any questions that you might have around this and beyond this webinar, how we might support you in it as well.
Looking at the inclusive hiring policy challenge. So in a large employer in Australia from the frontline industry, Jessie and myself worked on a project where we reviewed the hiring process. And overall, also in alignment with the targets the company had in place, the turnover of women was moving at a pace where it was clear that if things wouldn't change, they would not meet their target of women representation by 2025. So the solution, we reviewed their existing processes related to hiring and policies. And we also interviewed the recruiters in the company as well as the hiring managers. So what we identified was there was a lack of, while there was an overall target in place, that target was not filtered down and communicated down appropriately to all the stakeholders involved in the hiring process, which is a missed opportunity to get everybody coming to the journey aspect that I mentioned earlier, getting everybody on the same journey. So the recommendation provided was to establish clear accountabilities throughout the hiring process to avoid statements like, oh, that is not my remit, or that is usually the recruiter's role. So making sure that everybody speaks the same language and works towards the same goal. So also here, the inclusive hiring was one of your main questions. So if you would also let us know what you would like to hear about that element. Anyone? Or is it not working? No? Okay.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Hiring manager buy-in, one around inclusivity of neurodivergent applicants, case studies.
Okay. So still see some typing. So just wait for this one now before we move on. But there's already a lot there. Section. Okay. All right. Gender decoding. Okay. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. So that might have been a lot. And also thank you for sharing what you want to hear more about. As we said, we will come back to those points also throughout the Q&A, if there are no other questions coming from the audience. But as a recap, as Gemma was so kind, sharing some key findings of our What Women Want report, which you all have received or can obviously still download. We asked and you responded. So thank you again for sharing your input, what you wanted to learn more about. It was measuring progress in terms of DEI. So that's when Jessie was referring to our so-called scorecard and the proven process. Gaining company-wide buy-in and leadership support. Coming back to our little wheel, besides ethically, it's the right thing to do. There were lots of other aspects that you can relate to from a company performance perspective, safety, diversity, and legal reasons. Actionable insights. So you can see here 9 out of our 10 key standards that we touch base on. And while there are obviously overlaying aspects across those standards, those are the 9 that we covered today, from flexible working down to paid parental leave. And back to Gemma.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. That was very insightful. We are going to go to audience question and answer now. So we do have some questions in the chat. Please add some more. And of course, we also have the questions that you put into the Slido, which we can turn to after these. So the first question is, what is commuter leave? Is this additional leave for the time taken to get to and from work?
Yeah. I can take that one. So yes, that is leave in addition, and it is paid. So how it's working and executed on an employee level, they are basically applying it as time in lieu. So over time, you are accruing a certain ratio, you are noting it down, and then maybe depending on where you live, either once a week, you take your afternoon off, or over 2 weeks, you get a whole day. Over a month, you get a long weekend, Friday and Monday. So that is how that particular company has been applying the leave. So yes, it's a paid leave entitlement.
Thank you, Anna. The next question is this paid leave? But I believe this question came through when we were on the menopause section. So if I'm incorrect in that, please let us know. But yes, is menopause leave paid?
This will vary between organizations. So for some of the examples that we shared, there is a combination of paid and unpaid leave. The key that unites them is rather than lumping it under, your sick leave or your carer's leave where people usually take, it's an additional entitlement on top of that sick leave.
Thank you. The next question, again, I believe came through when we were on the menopause section, asking females in our organization, would they take this menopause leave? And they said they wouldn't. Ask their manager, how can we overcome the stigma?
I think or not personally, I think, but the real life or lived experience that we have seen from employers sharing their learnings, implementing that type of policy. As with a lot of things, you can't just launch a policy and let it sit there and expect it to be taken up, or even employees being aware of it. So very good in that regards that you already ask employees, and in particular women. But as Jessie also said earlier, it's extending beyond just the gender, or just beyond women, if they would take it up. So the answer that they wouldn't ask their manager, I would be curious if that was one individual or if that is a broader scale, if it was done in a survey. If it is one individual, that is difficult to reply to at this point. It might be just a direct report to a hiring or line manager situation or scenario. If it is on a broader scale, it's indicating around the lack of psychologically safety, that at this point, at that organizational level, it's the right time to introduce that language or expect employees to just go to their manager and think it's okay. So how to overcome it? Work with leaders as role models and start talking about it, that it is okay, and mentioning it not as a disadvantage or now we are implementing something for women and what about the men. That could be a bit more of an ease in policy introduction, the reproductive leave, which is entailing something for men and women. So that might be a phase one or an easier entry to introduce that language around menopause leave and making it okay to say, I'm not feeling myself. And we also have resources and webinars where we spoke about that topic. And that also entails a lot of valuable information and language to talk about and educate around this topic.
To add on to what Anna was saying, just a quick note on that. It can be quite scary to prepare for company-wide conversations around things like menopause, not knowing what the reception would be and how people will act. So while starting with the senior leadership is important and a critical place to really start to get that common understanding, I would ask organizations to see any potential backlash or some of the more difficult questions or comments as an opportunity to both show what your company stance is around inclusivity and the things that you do to take opportunities to educate and call people in to understanding, as oftentimes these questions or comments can come not from necessarily a place of malice, but sometimes genuine ignorance or oblivion, and using that to actually further your efforts. So not only viewing the internal comms as a one way, here's all the content we're going to produce and here's we're going to put it out, but equally as much as how you respond to how your employees engage with that information. Scary and easier said than done, but really a powerful opportunity to create a dialogue around it.
Thank you, Jessie and Anna. The next question is, life leave has been considered instead of offering different types of leave, such as menopause or mental health leave. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, the life leave, it's in terms of the size of the organization, might be a good first step because it is less financial burden on a company that you have one leave entitlement instead of spreading it out into various aspects. And also, again, coming back to the psychological safety level or maturity of an organization. In that type of life leave, there is no questions asked. So you don't have to specify why you are taking that leave. You are entitled to take time off, to disconnect for whatever reason. So it really depends on where you are at as an organization, what is the size, but it certainly is a valuable entitlement and benefit for an organization to have.
Things we've also discussed internally are that there's certain types of leave which have legislative requirements behind them. So, for example, being mindful of what sorts of things are encompassed under life leave. One thing that we have discussed as an organization and the advice we give to clients is, for example, for things like domestic and family violence, that this shouldn't be lumped into the life leave, and other things where you may have positive duty of care and other requirements to not get yourself into a position where you're accidentally not actually providing what is required of you as an organization. So just from that compliance perspective, to double check and see what you're planning to put into that life leave.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay, so we have no more questions come through the Q&A. Please continue to put them through, but we might move over to the Slido question. So I'll hand over to either Jessie or Anna if you want to start going through those.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. So, Jessie, there were questions. I think that one of the, we touched base on the menopause one, where it was around implementation, getting buy-in, education around the topic. Is there anything else that you wanted to share, also besides the question that we have answered from the audience?
Could we pop back into the Slido so the audience can also see the word cloud back up?
Yes, that's a good point.
Also jog people's memories, and if you had a question off of what people shared, feel free to put it in the Q&A as well.
Mm-hmm.
There we go.
So I think in terms of the education, it might be worthwhile sending out the webinar as a recording that we had with Menopause Australia. That would be a good one and can be used as well in terms of education for employees, also men, making sure that everyone is aware around experiences and actually how common it is. And it's not nothing to be ashamed of or to talk about.
Yep, nothing else from my side to add, as the questions we addressed before were around the menopause policy.
Yeah.
But if you feel like there's something else you'd like to explore, please pop it in the Q&A as well.
Absolutely. And then the other one might be a bit quicker. Was in terms of pay transparency.
I like the how transparent is transparent, if either of you are comfortable going into that one.
Well, I think to start that point, we at Work 180 always say progress is better than perfection. So starting at some level to be transparent and starting to collect data is a right step into the direction that you want to take towards transparency. And you can't change what you can't measure. So it starts with data in the end. So how transparent is transparent? Where you are at as an organizational level, we are starting in terms of with Regia now at the median pay gap. Next year, we will move to the mean. So also here, it's a great example. Starting somewhere, and we have seen in the UK over time, it helps to improve and to close the gender pay gap, at least towards in the right direction. So I think you just have to start collecting the data at this point where you are at in your journey.
My thoughts around this are similar to what I said about the opportunity for communication around the menopause education, which is that the transparency and the level that your organization chooses is a great opportunity. It's an opportunity to say, we understand the progress that we have to make, as what Anna mentioned. And it's an opportunity to say, here's what we're going to do about it. That's probably one of the top things that for those who do work with Work 180 have the ability to do, which is to proudly showcase all the initiatives they're taking to reduce their current gender pay gaps, as well as importantly, minimize the risk of ones occurring in the future. From our What Women Want report, we know that over half of the respondents would still apply for a company with that poor gender pay gap, as long as companies are able to detail what they're actually doing about it. So depending on your comfort level, there's I think the companies are focused a lot on the risk, but there's also great opportunity and reward in owning your results and also committing to that action.
Thank you. And a question has come through on pay transparency. Is the WGEA pay gap reporting truly reflective, given that it doesn't dig into the detail of role versus role, but an overall business summary?
I really like that this question was answered because it's a really common topic right now. Being that there is amongst organizations, employees, way to go to understand what we're talking about when we speak about the gender pay gap. The role versus role and equal pay for equal work is where we look at that equality of looking at like pay for like work. What this actually provides us and what's actually being reflected from the WGEA pay gap reporting is a composition of the overall organization. It's not to say departmentally, is this woman getting paid the same as this man who is also a software engineer, for example, but it allows us to see where is the concentration of gender across the organization. Does this pay gap reveal that we have more men in leadership positions, in higher individual contributor, higher paying positions? That's the sort of insight it allows the organization to actually take a step back and say, as a whole, where are people going and what is the reason? What are the barriers that we actually have in place? What's happening in our industry that may be creating some challenges, but what's within our influence to actually ensure that the business summary as a whole is being reflective of the gender composition of society? So a really great question, because it is really important for us to discuss and determine that difference right now.
Great. Thank you, Jessie. There are
I
no
would
more
like to
through
say something to the how to get executive commitment. I mean, depending on also how large the organization is, but having a pay gap reporting also in your annual reports as an example. So how to get executive commitment and make that under ESG criteria, so sustainability value proposition of an organization, which is becoming more and more important. Also looking at different generations, our Gen Z as an example, they want to work for organizations with that are committed to a social impact. And the pay gap is one of the data points that shows how committed is an organization also to driving gender equity. So executive buy-in start where your employees, your customers, where they are at, and bring that also into the conversation. It is not just only an employee measure or payment measure of your employee base. It also is interest, or also your customers, investors are looking at it.
I did write a CEO to CEO letter about the pay gap as well that you might find useful. So we'll note down to make sure that's distributed with the audience as well.
So we
Is there anything else that you wanted to take from that, or before we move on to the last slide that we had around the inclusive hiring?
I think we can move on to the inclusive hiring slide.
How to be inclusive of neurodivergent applicants. Jessie, that's your area of strength.
Yeah, I love this question, and I love that it came up a couple of times alongside intersectionality as a whole. We are lucky to partner with organizations who are doing some great work in this space. So earlier this year, we hosted an event with EY talking about neuro inclusion. Being at the event, some of the things that I managed to take away, which are really actionable. I loved how they talked about how breaking down job ads. So making sure that if you've got those really chunky job ads that have plenty of paragraphs, to try and translate as much of that as possible into dot points. Research shows that that's easier for someone who's neurodivergent to progress, but then we all agreed as a collective that regardless of if you're neurotypical or neurodivergent, no one really loves reading big chunks of text. So bullet points are actually a great win for everyone. There was also a note around how certain characteristics of neurodivergent individuals mean that things like receiving interview questions in advance can really help them put their best foot forward. And the conversation transpired where someone in the audience did raise their hand and say, well, what about the backlash that we might receive? And on one hand, bringing in that equity versus equality question is really pertinent. But the panelists actually said, well, what would happen if we did actually provide the interview questions to everyone in advance? So really getting people to think about the classic processes that we're used to are not always necessarily the ones that are going to help you identify and select the best people. And just because we haven't done it before, if one thing could be a great win for inclusivity, there's no reason why it couldn't be implemented. But those were two really practical tips about sharing the questions and also the bullet point job ads that I found really practical.
I would like to take or follow up on one of the questions. What were the key changes to the process? And I believe that was related to the prior case study. If not, please make a comment in the Q&A section. But key changes to the process, very simple: drive accountability. Make sure everyone is aware of their roles. So what is the role of a recruiter? What is the role of a hiring manager? And making sure everyone is aware of the hiring targets that the company is working towards to. So it's not just a recruiter problem. And further changes to the process was to put a process in place in the first place, because there was no process. There were no transparent hiring criteria or processes. Every hiring manager had, again, with good intent, their own questions that they ask, very often still sentences or statements like, oh, when I have a good feeling or gut feeling about a candidate, my gut has not betrayed me in the past. And those are statements that show there is good intent, but what is the impact? The impact is that bias is actually taking the lead in making candidates' decisions. So how can you unpack it? Besides, obviously, we know unconscious bias workshops are not a silver bullet. So putting processes and transparent criteria in place and steps can help to reduce some level of the bias that is involved in the hiring process. So these were the key changes. Put a process in place and drive clear accountability throughout the hiring process.
Thank you, Anna. We have 5 minutes to go, and we have some more sensitive slides at the end of this. So, Jessie, I'll hand over to you to set that context.
Absolutely. So thank you to everyone. We are at the almost end of all the content that we have prepared today. We did want to address both the questions that people had about policies and implementation that was received, as well as what women identified to be important workplace offerings to them, namely sexual harassment and some best case practices when it comes to things like different types of parental leave. So the following slides do discuss some examples that may be distressing to some audience members. So we'd like to invite you to feel free to leave at this point. Thank you so much for attending and joining the conversation with us, and to take care of yourselves. We'll give a little while for anyone who needs to hop out of the call, and then we're happy to share the last 2 case studies. All right. So the sexual harassment case study we have from BHP lays out a fairly significant challenge. So as early as 2018, sexual harassment was defined to be a health and safety risk for the company. And the parliamentary inquiry into sexual harassment against women in the fly-in and fly-out workforce found in BHP's submission alleging rape and indecent assault from certain employees. There were 103 reported and closed sexual harassment cases, and these are only the verified ones, not the overall number of cases. So this was the context that BHP was working with. There were a number of things that were put in place and continue to progress, starting with the linking of executive and senior leader remuneration towards progress. We've spoken at length, and a lot of you have wanted to know about that leadership buy-in. The step where leadership buy-in is had, and it's very obvious how business critical certain situations can be, would be to really set some targets in place that place that accountability onto executives and make sure that it is being driven down from the top from a system perspective. There were a number of initiatives, including but not limited to active bystander training, positive duty consultation, framework creations for disclosure, as well as internal comms. It's important to note here that BHP had also sought a lot of external consultation to ensure that their practices were being reflective. There were also targets further set to comply with the sexual harassment program, and in the spirit of intersectionality, working as well with their LGBT plus ally employee inclusion group to co-design an inclusive grievance and support process. So recognizing that people of different lived experiences and identities can and do face sexual harassment, and making sure that that process doesn't pose even more barriers to actually disclosing. If we take a look at the impact, there now is better visibility into all existing cases, regardless of when they were reported. You are actually able to find all of this data online if you look at BHP's annual reports, and it has been covered by the media as well. So there is that incredible level of transparency and a cultural shift noted by the CEO, where previously one of the areas of concern was potential underreporting. So in this case, while an increase in cases is sobering, it does point to the fact that people are stepping forward and using the tools to make those reports, and the way that BHP is actually dealing with the perpetrators of the cases as well, which they have also been publicly reporting. Next slide. So from Metro Trains in Melbourne, there's been a great change in their paid parental leave offerings, the challenge being that their existing policies didn't account for a wider scope of parental and guardianship experiences, which led to that solution of doing a review for the areas that weren't currently covered. And in 2023, the resulting impact was the introduction of between 2 to 14 weeks of paid child or baby mortality leave to account for that wider array of experiences. And also for those parents undergoing surrogacy, 1 week of paid prenatal leave for the purpose of surrogacy related appointments. For me, a great example of really taking the diversity of experiences that parents and guardians can have and making sure that they're embedding into policies to really support those whose journeys may not be the typical ones. So with any of these, feel free to chat with us further if you want any insight, but I'll hand back to Gemma to wrap things up.
Yeah, I just want to say, Jessie and Anna, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I took a lot out of that and really appreciate it, and I'm sure our audience does as well. And if our audience members would like to know more about becoming endorsed or working with Work 180, our website is work180.com. So thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.